Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. The war in Gaza and the attacks on October 7 have had widespread ramifications. There's obviously the war on the battlefields in the Gaza Strip, the attacks against Israel from various fronts, including directly from Iran, and the explosion of antisemitism around the world, unraveling the feeling of security for Jewish communities across the globe. Our next two episodes are going to be a two-part dive into Jewish education and what has happened around the world with Jewish day schools and Jewish families when thinking about the future of their children. Where do they want them to go to school? What do they want them to study when it comes to Israel in the classroom? And what are the challenges that the educators are facing? On today's episode, the first part of this deep dive, we'll hear a review of the situation in Jewish communities across the globe from JPPI fellow Dr. Nadia Beider. Nadia holds a PhD in contemporary Jewry from Hebrew University, where she continues to teach Jewish education and also works as a demographer, a job she has held at places like the Claims Conference. I then speak with Matt Reingold, a Jewish educator for more than 15 years, who currently teaches at TanenbaumCHAT, a big Jewish school in Toronto. Matt holds a PhD in Jewish education from Toronto's York University and is the author of 4 books about, interestingly, Jewish and Israeli comics. He's also co-edited a volume about teaching about Israel. This is interesting. Here we go. Nadia, it's great to have you back on the podcast. Thank you so much for being with us. And on today's episode, we're looking at the interesting topic, at least I guess I think it's interesting for what it's worth, and I get to make the decisions of what we talk about. But I think it is interesting of what's been happening at Jewish day schools around the world, definitely post October 7th. But you've been, you as a demographer have been looking a lot at the data over the years and closely tracking enrollment, what numbers look like, how many Jewish kids are there, how many Jewish kids are going to Jewish day schools, how many are not. And also with whatever data we have, even though it's only been 8 months since October 7th, so we don't yet have a full picture, but we have some indicators of where things stand. So why don't you walk us through, if you can, what is the situation until now, and where are things now and where are things going as much as possible?
Absolutely. So the first thing to note is that, like Jews, Jewish schools are spread across the world. So there are kind of over 50 countries where there are Jewish day schools. But there's huge variation. So not surprisingly, by far the highest concentration of Jewish schools is in Israel. And then we have much smaller numbers of Jewish day schools across the world. So quite a lot of countries have one Jewish day school option. And then, those smaller communities. And then we have quite a lot of Jewish day schools in the United States. Not surprising, by far the largest Jewish population outside of Israel, and then really decreasing numbers.
And just for our listeners and viewers to understand, the definition of a Jewish day school, can you define for us what that means? Because I mean, when I grew up in Chicago, I went to a Jewish day school. It was an Orthodox school, but there were also Salmon Schechters. And now there's in recent years, say probably maybe at least in the last 30 years, I feel like they've come more into existence than before, but what they call community schools. So, cross that denomination. So what is a Jewish school?
Okay. So as far as I'm concerned, any school that defines itself as a Jewish school is a Jewish school. So that includes schools that are majority in terms of their student population, not Jewish. Classic example, King David Birmingham in the UK is majority Muslim in terms of the student population. But we actually see, non-Jewish populations in Jewish schools across the world. It can range from schools that see Judaism as a religion and spend maybe all their time or a good chunk of their time doing Jewish studies, to schools that don't go beyond what's required in the national curriculum. In a lot of countries, you have to do religious studies. So they'll teach Judaism. They might teach about Judaism and other religions. Schools that just kind of have a Jewish ethos and maybe celebrate some Jewish events. Schools that are informed by Jewish values. So really, as far as I'm concerned, any school that defines itself as Jewish, any day school, it counts as a Jewish day school. The only kind of school that aren't included in this analysis, that some people might argue should be, that are quite small, it's not so many schools, are charter schools, Hebrew language charter schools.
I was going to ask you about those because I went once to one of those schools in Brooklyn and was blown away. But regular public school, everything looked normal. But then you walk into some of these classrooms and you have African American kids, Hispanic kids, Latino kids, of course, Caucasian, and I guess some Jewish kids all talking Hebrew. And it was like, what's going on here? But those are not Jewish schools.
Well, not for the purpose of this study. They're a super interesting case, but by definition, so Hebrew language charter schools, I should explain, are a phenomenon in the United States where there's strict separation of church and state. So the idea is that they are public schools, and therefore they cannot be associated with any religious group, but they are Hebrew language schools. So for people who would like perhaps the option of learning some Jewish culture or Israeli culture, that might appeal. People who maybe want to find a population of Jews, but within the public school system, a school maybe with some Jewish students. So it appeals on that sense, but by definition, they're not Jewish. They don't teach Jewish studies. They can't. It's not part of the curriculum there. So for the purpose of these studies, they're not included. Like I said, it's not a very widespread phenomenon, and it's limited to the United States. So yeah, not included in this. But it also wouldn't change the picture very much. So if we're looking here at Jewish school enrollment rates, for instance, so okay, Israel, pretty much all the Jewish children go to Jewish schools, assuming we define, Israeli schools, secular, religious, if we define them all as Jewish, which I think is a legitimate thing to do. Many Jewish students learn Jewish history, learn the Bible, learn the language, and so on and so on. But then we see, I've just kind of looked at a few of the English-speaking countries here, just to kind of give a comparison. So, you have countries with quite high enrollment rates, like South Africa and England, and high in this context is about 65, 70-something%. Australia is an interesting case because we've seen declining enrollment rates over the past decade or so, maybe a bit longer, something to do with a generational turnover. So Australia is a community that was really founded either by refugees pre-World War II or Holocaust survivors post-World War II. And as the generations move on, the kind of not having a grandfather or a grandmother who was a survivor sort of changes the priority of Jewish education. A lot of those grandparents also actively paid for their grandchildren's Jewish education, and those people are no longer with us. And Canada and really the USA is an outlier. It has an incredibly low rate of Jewish day school enrollment among young Jewish people.
Why is that?
Well, number one thing would obviously be the cost. The second really important thing is the makeup of the American Jewish population. So if we think about the American Jewish population, it's about 10% Orthodox. Generally, almost all Orthodox Jews send their children to Jewish day schools, assuming there is one where they live. You've got exceptional cases like high school in Switzerland or whatever, but in general, that's the thing. And in America, that's certainly wherever there is a Jewish day school, they tend to send. And just, we can see here, if we look at trends in Jewish day school enrollment in the United States by religious affiliation within Judaism, we can see that if you look at these lines that are increasing, we can see that among the Hasidic and Yeshivish stream, there's a huge increase in Jewish day school enrollment. That's not because suddenly Hasidim and people who identify as Yeshivish have started sending
more kids.
They're just having lots of kids, and the population is growing really fast, and it's continuing to this day. So that the majority of children enrolled in Jewish day school in the United States are going to Hasidic and Yeshivish schools. So it's not even including Chabad, it's not including centrist, modern Orthodox, right? If you add those, all of those, the vast majority. So that's what we see there. But in America, the Orthodox, who constitute the vast majority of kids in Jewish day schools, are really fairly small minority of the American Jewish population as a whole, relative to other countries where we have bigger concentrations of Orthodox populations. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story we can see is the collapse. I don't know if you can see this light green line at the bottom is the collapse in the Solomon Schechter day school movement, for instance. So you did used to have a good percentage of children from conservative homes going to conservative Jewish day schools.
And not the politically conservative, Jewish.
No, Jewish conservative, yes. Good to make that distinction. Yes, so in terms of religious identity, they identified as conservative within Judaism, and there's really been a sharp decline. There's also been a decline in...
Well, there's been an overall, correct me if I'm wrong, but overall in America, in the US, there's been a decline in membership in the conservative United Synagogue and right.
Absolutely. And what's interesting is where we do see population growth among American Jews who aren't Orthodox, but where we're seeing it is that people are increasingly willing to identify as Jewish. So in the past, maybe someone who had one Jewish parent would say, I'm not Jewish. And now increasingly they do, but those kinds of people aren't going to Jewish schools. That's not, where they are. So the vast majority of people who are not Orthodox are not going to day schools, but also a recent report has shown that they're also not going to supplementary schools. So supplementary schools are Jewish educational frameworks in the afternoons or on the weekends for people who go to, public or non-Jewish private schools. And there we also see a really sharp decline. So there's an awful lot of people who are not Orthodox, basically an increase in the proportion who are getting no kind of Jewish education at all. And that's a real shift.
Interesting.
So, yes. But like I said, there are different trends going on in different countries, kind of not so different from the United States in terms of the increase in the Haredi education. We can look at England, which actually in terms of numbers of students in Jewish day schools is probably the second, maybe the third. I'm just collecting final data on France. It's between those two in terms of numbers of children in Jewish day schools. And like America, the majority of children enrolled in Jewish day schools in England are Haredi, in Haredi schools. But what's interesting in England is you've got a different makeup in terms of the size of the Orthodox community relative to the conservative reform in England.
But also, correct me if I'm wrong, in England, Nadia, you also get government funding for Jewish schools, right? So you would expect, if that's the case, that you'd have more Jewish kids per capita in their schools because there isn't a funding issue, as opposed to, let's say, in the United States, where it can cost you an arm and a leg to send a child to a Jewish day school. Does that actually play out in the numbers?
Absolutely, but with one caveat. Back in the 1980s, Jewish schools were still, certainly the majority of them, certainly the ones that serve the modern Orthodox or the non-religious populations were state schools, meaning they were, free essentially, or small contribution required. But the percentage of kids going to those schools was pretty low. And it has increased over time. And the reason it's increased over time is there was huge investment. There was communal recognition that Jewish day schools were a priority. If people weren't going to go to Jewish day schools, the odds of them being involved in anything Jewish later in life were pretty low. And so those schools went from being schools where only people who failed to get into the good high schools went, and schools where the educational standards were pretty low. A lot of investment was put in to raise academic standards. And so you can see now, if you look at the list of kind of the best high schools in England based on their scores and GCSEs and A-levels, which are the exams you have in England.
Yeah, like Riot in Israel, right?
Exactly, right. Or whatever matriculation in whatever country you're in, it's the equivalent. And you see that the Jewish schools are right up there, some of them, quite a good number of them at the top of the list. And so what's happened is that people will go to those schools because, as you said, they're free, but also because they provide a really high level of education. And for some people, the fact they're Jewish isn't necessarily a plus. So a recent EU survey, 2018, when England was still in the EU, was looking at anti-Semitism. And, we'll come probably in a second to the way anti-Semitism is affecting school choice. But what we found, the data showed there was that a lot of parents actually would rather their children went to in a school environment that was not exclusively Jewish. They would prefer
Jewish parents, we're talking.
Jewish parents, talking about whether they want to send to a Jewish school. So a lot of parents, I can stop with this graph now. A lot of parents were actually really more interested in sending to a non-Jewish school because they wanted their child to be exposed to society. That, society isn't composed only of Jews. So it's important that they learn how to get along in society, that they are with other people, that they're with people from different backgrounds, they learn to get along, are very much a support from a philosophical point of view for multiculturalism. And so for some people, that's really important. But the other thing the survey showed is that anti-Semitism is a real concern when people are choosing schools for their children. And for the majority of parents, it pushes them to choose a Jewish school. There was a minority who considered a Jewish school potentially as a dangerous site in and of itself. We've seen attacks on Jewish school in France, at Sahatora and Toulouse. So there was a minority who felt that way, but for the majority of parents, they were more concerned about bullying and being ostracized inside the school environment, and therefore were more likely to choose a Jewish school.
So tell me now, what has life been like in these Jewish schools since the explosion of anti-Semitism in the post October 7th reality? Obviously, Israel is very different in what we've had. Our kids are just all traumatized here and barely go to school, but that's a separate issue. I always say I feel bad for my younger two who have been through COVID for 2 years, basically didn't really have school. This year, October 7th, which is very close to the beginning of the school year, obviously, has just cast a large shadow, a dark shadow over the entire school year. While they've still been in school, it's been very difficult to see them, in the way they've been studying. But anyhow, what has it done to the United States, to Canada, to England, to other places in the diaspora?
Okay, so I first want to say that alongside everything you've said about the Israeli school system, there's also been tremendous resilience. Things have gone on as much as possible. And the children, a lot of children have been having a hard time, but then they've also kind of been developing this resilience. So if we want to talk about the diaspora, then a few things to note. One interesting thing has been this concern that Jewish students are a target outside school. We've actually seen attacks on Jewish schools in Montreal, for example. And so in the largest Jewish day school in Europe, JFS, students were told not to wear. So in a lot of countries, we have school uniforms. So they were told not to wear, their jackets, their school jackets, which they originally, in the rules of the school, you have to wear on your way to and from school as well. Not to wear them, it's too dangerous. They might be targeted. In Australia, certainly at least one of the schools has taken away the uniform policy altogether because it's too dangerous to be identified. Clearly, their uniform's quite distinctive and they don't want the students to be identified. So there's a real physical concern. Another phenomenon is an increase in interest in Jewish schools. So for instance, the Prisma survey showed that there have been a lot more inquiries from parents interested in moving their children to Jewish schools. We actually see that in higher education as well.
Because of the anti-Semitism they're facing in public schools, let's say.
Yes, because of concerns over anti-Semitism in mainstream schools. The same thing anecdotally we hear in Austria, for instance, that there's been kind of an increase in demand. There was a Kol Ha'am survey that showed that people were more likely, American Jews were more likely to consider sending their children to day school since October 7th. And then the other thing that's happened has been an increase in students from two sources. One is Israeli Jews living abroad who are used to the public school system, aren't necessarily linked in with the Jewish community, don't really feel a need for a religious school. It's not something, maybe they're not interested in religious education, and that's the Jewish option they see locally. There have been increased numbers enrolling in schools of that community. And also in the very short term, there's been a surge in people. There have been people, particularly people who have roots or families abroad who've left Israel temporarily. And then also you've seen an increase in numbers. And, in different
They have not been sending to day schools until now.
Well, these are people who live in Israel. So this final group is a group of people who live in Israel, have left post-October 7th, either for a break or for longer term. We don't really know yet. And there have been increased numbers. Now, the numbers aren't huge, but they can be concentrated in certain schools. So certain schools will.
And these are people who we expect are temporarily relocating because of the war.
Yes, that's the assumption. Temporarily located. They need support. Their husbands are, maybe, enlisted, and they need. They don't typically they don't have family support, right? These are immigrants, so they've gone home. They've got small babies or about to have babies or that kind of thing. So it's not numerically huge, but in certain schools it's very strongly felt. If there's a specific school where suddenly there's 5 more families. Jewish schools are not all necessarily so big, so small numbers of families with several children really impact.
So Nadia, if you had to guess the long-term impact, and I know academics don't like to guess, they like to have data, but I come from a journalistic background, so we just make things up, right? But if you had to guess for a moment, what is the long-term trajectory going to look like here? How does it feel? Because on the one hand, you're saying two things. There is maybe a slight decline because people are more, not necessarily a decline in numbers, but let's take off the uniform, let's hide who we are, let's not be overtly Jewish, although we are going to a Jewish day school. But on the other hand, slight uptick in numbers, anecdotally at least, because people are, they want to feel safer from the anti-Semitism they're facing maybe in public schools. Long term, where does this take us?
Okay, so if we want to look long term, I guess we're better off starting with those long term trends that I spoke at the beginning. If you would have asked me, 10 months ago, what do I see the future of Jewish education? I would have said like this: continuing increase, boom, whatever in the Haredi education system, and pretty much decline everywhere else, just from demographic reasons. Meaning, even if the same percentage of non-Orthodox children were to keep going to Jewish school, the birth rate's declining, people have delaying marriage, delaying parenthood. I would have said that's the future, and we really need to think about school closures, bringing schools together, those kind of things. It's possible, and it's very sad to say this, it's possible that one of the awful outcomes of October 7th is an increase in anti-Semitism, so we're seeing that. And if that continues, then like we've seen in France over the past couple of decades, that the increase in anti-Semitism has pushed Jewish school numbers up, and it pushes them up among the non-Orthodox, because the Orthodox and the religious, like we said, are already in Jewish schools.
Right.
There's not going to be a shift there. There's no increase possible, really. But it's possible that what we've seen in France, that the numbers have been pushed up by concerns over anti-Semitism in regular schools, will increase the number of Jewish day schools. I guess that's a positive silver lining out of a pretty awful situation. But that's definitely a possibility at this stage, like I said, and like you said, it's too soon to really tell, and also very hard to predict where things are going to go.
But interesting to think about. Nadia, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Matt Reingold, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Jakob.
So, TanenbaumCHAT, big school in Toronto. Why don't you tell us first just a bit about the school, how many students there are, and then we'll talk a bit about what things have been like after October 7th.
Yeah, so TanenbaumCHAT is Toronto's community high school. It stands for Community Hebrew Academy of Toronto. It's a school for students in grades 9 to 12. We have over 1,400 students enrolled in the school. When October 7th happened was actually Thanksgiving long weekend in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And so we didn't come back to school on the Monday, we came back to school on the Tuesday. And already over the weekend, the school had announced that there would be a school-wide assembly held Tuesday morning as a coming together assembly, where administrators and staff and students could talk a little bit about what happened, share information so that everyone was aware. With so much misinformation on social media, even in those first few days, the school felt that it was important both to provide content, but also a space for coming together as a community to really embrace the idea of Community Hebrew Academy of Toronto.
And these students come from across the spectrum, right, of religious observance.
Yeah, we have a number of feeder schools, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. We also have from secular or Zionist schools. We also have a program called New Stream, kids who come not from the Jewish day school system, who are entering Jewish day school really for the first time. And we have over 90 New Stream students in grade 9 alone this year.
So you're someone who spent a lot of time teaching about Israel and researching also about study of Israel in schools. So before we talk about after October 7th, like what was it like in the school in terms of Israel studies prior, let's say, the years until now?
Yeah, so we have a number of full-time Israeli faculty. We have shlichim who come from Israel to teach Hebrew and Jewish studies. We also have a full-time informal Jewish educator who only does Israel programming, an Israel engagement shlicha, or shaliach. This year happens to be a shlicha. We teach Jewish history through all 4 years of our Jewish studies program. In grade 11, half the year is dedicated to the study of modern Israel. We also have a grade 12 full year elective on contemporary Israeli culture and society. It's taught by myself and a few other teachers, and me and a colleague just recently redesigned the curriculum for next year. And so students have multiple points of Israel contact over the course of the year. We do programming for Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom HaZikaron. We also run a few different optional trips to Israel over the course of a year, including sending students on the Shalva Marathon. And so we are very much a Zionist school. It is part of our ethos and culture and values.
And Israel plays a very prominent role, it seems, in the core curriculum of what is taught there at the school.
Absolutely.
I was looking at some of the books that you've written or co-authored. There's Teaching Israel, Studies of Pedagogy from the Field. There's comic books about Israel studies, which I think is really cool. So just tell us, like, I'm curious about that. I was, like many kids, used to love reading comic books. Nowadays, I get to watch the Marvel movies with my kids. So, I'm intrigued a bit by the comic book aspect of it.
Yeah. So sounds like you, I grew up reading comic books. And then when I was in graduate school, I found myself in a course on disability in society. And the professor said, write a research paper about whatever you want. And I kind of took the course because I heard good things about the professor. It wasn't a topic that I was very familiar with. And the course was wonderful and the professor was lovely. And I said, there's a superhero who's blind. Could I write about representations of blindness in comic books? And she was like, sure. I don't know what any of that means, but like, run with it. And as I started reading, I discovered this whole community of academic and scholarly work about comics and graphic novels. And I really fell in love with that. I did some work on Daredevil, the blind superhero, but my interest, even in grad school, was always Jewish education. And I began writing about representations of Jewishness in comics and graphic novels, and then shifting really to the Israeli scene. And so I've done a lot of writing along with an Israeli scholar named Asaf Gamzu. And so he and I are two of the big people who are writing about Israeli comics. And then about 3-4 years ago, I started shifting to political cartoons, thinking about how political cartoons could become part of my teaching about Israel. That one of the limitations of comics or graphic novels is, first of all, they're expensive, but it's also, you're dedicating a lot of time to doing a novel study, whereas that wasn't really the focus of my course. I wanted to show what is going on in Israeli society today. And the beauty of political cartoons is that they are timely and relevant and short, and you can use like 10 in a lesson, and kids can see different perspectives of the diversity of Israeli society and the different voices that are coming out of Haredi and secular and Dati and right-wing and left-wing communities. And so I began studying political cartoons, and I wrote a book about Israeli political cartoons during the electoral crisis from a few years ago, and have continued to use cartoons in my teaching.
We could use some cartoons nowadays also here in Israel and probably across the Jewish world. It's interesting also when you think about it that I could be wrong, but this is kind of digressing for a moment, but Jews were big writers of comic books back, Stan Lee, for example, one of the big creators of a lot of those Marvel superheroes. So let's fast forward for a moment to the way things might have shifted in terms of the focus after October 7th. Like, tell me some of the challenges. I'm guessing, we all know about the explosion of anti-Semitism. It's been everywhere, definitely the United States, Europe, of course, Canada as well. A very different challenge than what, say, we're facing here in Israel in terms of the physical danger that the Israelis find themselves in. But, Jews of the diaspora find themselves also in physical danger, but also, very much a sense of apprehension and insecurity that wasn't necessarily there. So how does it manifest itself in the school space, but also in the curriculum?
So thank you for the question. I think that it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. I mostly teach students in grade 12. And so they are, as they are in my course, they are also in other courses, of course, but they are also thinking about, well, where am I going next year? What is the next part of my schooling? And Canada, the university system in Canada works a little bit different than the American one. So while American colleges were experiencing these encampments towards the end of the high school year, most universities in Canada were kind of wrapped up by the time encampments started. And so that large proliferation of campus events was not felt the same way here. At the same time, many campuses here did have encampments. It's just that they were mostly held for summer session students, and there were less people on campus. At the same time, the presence of these encampments has made many of my students start to think about, well, where am I going next year? And I'm hearing talk of no longer just students asking, well, what is Jewish life like on campus, but also what is anti-Jewish life like on campus, and what is anti-Israel life like on campus? That whereas before they were actively thinking about what is the community I'm going to be able to find myself a part of, that if I want to continue being part of Jewish programming, what does this university offer versus that university? They're now also thinking about what are the spaces being used for to campaign against the things that I care about. And I don't think those were the same considerations that many had before. There were a few outliers of like, oh, I don't want to go to this school because it has a known reputation. But now many of them are talking about like, oh, there was something at this campus and this campus, and I don't know which one to go to. But what it's also led some of them to realize is that it in certain ways doesn't matter where they choose to go to, because all of the places that they are going to have had something over the last few months. And in Canada, we have far fewer universities than in America. And so they're more concentrated. And so there isn't the same, oh, I'm in Florida, and so therefore it really positively and shut things down. My students have talked about how they've asked their parents to go and visit encampments in downtown Toronto, where we live, just so they can see it with family or with friends before they go to campus in the fall, so that they have some idea what it looks like, just to familiarize themselves, not for the goal of being part of it, but just to be able to get over the shock value of seeing it, which is not something that was happening before October 7th.
Anecdotally, I don't know if you have the numbers on this, but if you are teaching in the final year of high school, do you see more kids who are coming to Israel on a gap year? Is that in decline? Do you think it's going to change? Because what you are kind of describing is people being the kids being more aware of their Jewishness, let's say. Not that they didn't know, they were obviously in a Jewish school, but now how will that play itself out in a fully secular or non-Jewish environment? And looking for safe spaces and a place that will be comfortable and accepting. Maybe also Israel is becoming more of an option, or is the risk of war something that is deterring people from coming?
I think there's obviously cost associated with gap year. Canadian universities, also, for those who are listening from America, considerably cheaper to go to university in Canada than elsewhere. And so while America,
and cheaper in Israel, by the way, also to come
and
to
cheaper in Israel, if you want to make Aliyah, it's much cheaper.
Yes.
Even if not Aliyah, it's cheaper if you're going to an Israeli program. I think that there are a few who are saying gap year, giving it a year to sort of like hopefully cool down on campuses. But I think that for many of them, it's at the end of the day, a lot of them are still saying, I'm going to the place that I'm going to because there's going to be something everywhere I go. And so finding the right program, finding the right people, ultimately, at least at my school, there's a very small pool of schools that people are going to. Most are staying in Ontario. A few are going to McGill in Quebec. A few are going east. A few are going further west. But even within Ontario, it's not that most schools are on the table. There's the ones that have large Jewish populations that, anecdotally, I would say it's the same numbers are going to the same schools.
I think for people, I'm old enough to remember when Netanyahu visited Concordia a bunch of years ago. This is maybe 20 years ago, if not more. And was met with riots that you probably don't even see in the United States. Although nowadays you probably would see, but smashed windows, people out on the streets. It was really it was quite the scene back then. Talk to me for a moment about the questions that students have been grappling with on their own inside school since October 7th. Like, their focus is more on the anti-Semitism. It's more on what's happened to Israel. It's what on Israel is has been doing in the way it's been prosecuting the war, the questions that bring up for people? Like, where do you see the young people's minds drifting?
So I think they're in a number of different directions. First and foremost is I found myself, I had always been teaching about disengagement from Gaza. That's part of my curriculum. Disengagement from Gaza, though, has taken on new relevance for students that, whereas before, disengagement from Gaza was, oh, it's something that we learn in history and we learn about it, and it happened approximately 20 years ago. And yes, there were attacks on border communities. But it wasn't something that they saw as like vital to their understanding of modern Israel. Whereas since October 7th, we've been doing a lot more teaching about, well, what is Gaza? What is the history of Gaza? Who are the people in Gaza? What was Israel's relationship? What was the decision made by Prime Minister Sharon to disengage from Gaza? Why was there opposition to disengagement from Gaza for both religious reasons, but also political security reasons?
Right.
And so there's that piece of like wanting to understand. I think a separate is trying to understand what are they seeing on social media and understanding like how to respond to what they are seeing, asking questions about what they are seeing, figuring out what is at stake for me if I choose to respond. If I choose to engage with my friends from public school who are maybe reposting things that I don't think they really understand what they're reposting, but they are reposting. And that's upsetting to me when, like last week, a number of students talked to me about how they're bothered by their friends on hockey teams or their friends from camp reposting all eyes on Rafah. And they're saying, my non-Jewish friends are posting this thing and they don't know what Rafah is. And do I want to respond to them? Do I not want to respond to them? Do I block them? Do I not? And these decisions are showing that they are thoughtfully engaging with what they are seeing from the people around them. And they are actively making choices about how to respond to what they are seeing. I'm at a conference right now and I shared some research. I found myself studying a group of Taylor Swift fans at my school this year who were upset at Taylor Swift's attendance at a comedy show fundraiser for Gaza that received virtually no media attention, but was very troubling to them. And I studied this community of students to understand the moves they made as they felt conflicted in their identity as Swifties and their very strong identities as Zionists and pro-Israel students, and hearing how they stopped listening to her music and unfollowing her and being like upset with her for this decision she made. That kids are, at least the ones that I'm interacting with in our school, are really actively thinking about how and in what ways do I show my love of Israel, my commitment to Israel. I think teachers are grappling with, in the past, everyone has laptops in class. And so kids have lots going on their computers, and at times they're distracted. The distractions now, though, are like, oh, did you see 5 minutes ago, Times of Israel just posted this update about, they announced that, I don't know, rockets were being fired or whatever it is. And I'm like, no, I didn't see. I'm standing in front of the room teaching you. But they're updating information and wanting to share information. And on one hand, I love the fact that on their own, they are spending time reading about Israeli news and wanting to consume Israeli content. And at the same time, figuring out, well, how do I bring that into the class when I don't know who their sources are? What is their intel? Where are they getting it from? And has it been verified yet?
I wondered though, because obviously, I always think about the fact that like today we all have so much information at the reach of the touch of a button or a finger on a phone, and the ability to access amazing amounts of information and learn as much as we want. On the other hand, we have so many useful idiots out there who don't know and are not willing to actually read up and study and inform themselves. But it's interesting how people the people are very engaged, and the question really is like, how do you how does this in a school setting, right? How do you navigate this in a way that you can steer the kids to make their own informed decisions without necessarily pushing them in a direction based on political agendas, if they might be there?
So that's something that I think is really important. A number of years ago, Alex Thompson and Hagit Cohen-Wolf and I think Jack Wertheimer published that there are a few different styles of Israel educator. They have what they call explorers, and I try to model myself on the explorer model, which is that there are boundaries within the classroom. And I'm still curating content, but I'm intentionally providing students with a diversity of voices within the text that I'm choosing. And so to come back to what I said earlier about political cartoons, unlike a novel where if I'm choosing something by David Grossman or a graphic novel by Asaf Hanaka, that's one voice. And then they might not see the voice by a more right-wing voice or a more dati voice. They're not hearing, if I'm choosing David Grossman, then they might not be hearing Chaim Sabato. What I can do with political cartoons by showing 5 at a time is, well, here's the right-wing cartoonist, and here's the left-wing cartoonist, and here's the dati cartoonist. And first of all, let's talk about what are the different perspectives they bring. But this also gives students an opportunity to see themselves in the class and also to see people who are different than them in the class. And because part of what my value that I'm bringing to my Israel education courses, and I know and I speak the same for most of the teachers that I interact with, both at the conference and certainly all of the teachers that I interact with at my school, is that we want students to see diversity within Israeli society. That's what is the richness of it. And for me, one of my ways in, and for other people, it's poetry or it's music. My way in is political cartoons.
And I think that probably a lot of people don't recognize or realize that there's so much diversity of opinions when it comes to even what's happening as we speak inside, the Gaza Strip, or what's the right move to make, whether it's, a hostage deal or end the war, continue the war. Everyone seems to have an idea that this is what Israel wants, when it's very difficult to explain what Israel wants sometimes.
There are many Israels.
Yes.
And there was great unity after October 7th. And I would say even in my school, that was felt. I interviewed students immediately after October 7th as part of data collection. And they spoke about how they felt that their school, especially these new stream students who are new to formal Jewish education, that they felt community. They felt part of something. They felt this coming together, surrounded by something that everyone cared so deeply about, and that was an extremely powerful moment for them. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that we can do in Israel education. Is highlight diversity, but also highlight unity and these common values that we care so deeply about here in the diaspora.
Well, these are challenges that I think we in Israel don't always appreciate and completely understand, because in Israel, obviously, very focused on the war, the soldiers, the fighting, but also when we see diaspora, it's tent encampments at Columbia University, or acts of anti-Semitism, a shooting up of a shul in Montreal, as shots were fired at one night, or things along
Toronto last week.
Yeah, so very focused on the physical manifestation, but there's obviously the spiritual or the confidence, the emotional well-being also. And I think we all have the interest in having a proud Jewish community, no matter where they are around the world. So thank you, Matt, for obviously what you do. And I'm going to have to read some of these comic books now, or books about comics. I have to read them as well.
I've been running sessions for adults about cartoons, and one of the first ones, one of the people said, when I saw comics, I didn't realize it was going to be like this. These are not lighthearted comics. These are sharp and critical and beautiful and powerful texts about responding to tragedy. And thank you so much for allowing me to be here and to speak about my experiences.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us this week on the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. We invite you to join us every Monday and Thursday. In the meantime, have a good weekend. Shabbat Shalom.